Good morning, Revolution, and welcome to our Friday morning program. We're on live on YouTube and all the socials at 10:30 every Friday. And I'm here today with Joe and CJ and Taryn. Welcome, you guys. I hope everyone listening is embracing the economic blackout today. Don't spend your money today. No buying at Amazon or Target or using your debit or credit cards. We're having a day where people are reminded of some economic power of consumers. But that's for today. Thank you for tuning in. And we have a topic today of the New World Order, and a frightening one it is. We're talking about election results that show that there's momentum among far-right parties across Europe and some parts of Asia and Latin America. And of course, we have our own brand in the United States. And today we want to talk about the elements of that momentum and why it's happening right now. And we have a lot of most important things that we have to talk about is how can we fight back against this momentum. So today I just want to start with CJ. CJ, I think you've spent a lot of time in the last year or so on the ground in Europe and in Asia, and you've done a lot of international reporting. I just wonder, what observations have you made in your travels and in your reporting about the trend toward the new right, the far right around the world?
Yeah, living in the U.S., we often it's a tendency we have to sort of live in our bubble, as big as it is. We live in a big country, and we look at the trends that are unfolding here. But if you open up and scan across the world, you see that there are similar movements that are saying some of the same things, and they're growing in power. Whether you're talking in France, in Germany, in Britain. In Asia, of course, there's the movements in India and the Philippines. And a lot of them are saying some of the same kind of rhetoric. They're appealing to nationalism. They're appealing to, the need for a new order, more authority for the government to carry out whatever task the right wing might want to push. But these things, they aren't just arising out of nowhere, right? And there is a reason why they're all happening at the same time. And something that I've been able to gather from the conversations I've had with people in the different places I've been reporting is they keep all pointing to the economics of the situation, of why this is happening now. And we're not talking about just the ups and downs of the stock market of the last several months or the last year. We're looking at really the last big great crisis of capitalism, the 2008-2009 financial recession. The financial crisis and the Great Recession that it sparked. And, in capitalism, in political economy, sometimes these things take a little while to shake out. And it's only in hindsight that you can really see what's been happening. And I think if you look at the crisis that started in that period, a lot of these trends and developments of the right wing saying, we have a solution. We have the way out of this crisis. That's what we're witnessing now, is a response to that. And they're using different kind of ways to sell that response, be it racism, be it sexism, attacks on LGBTQ people, and of course, as always, it's a cover for attacks on labor. So it's something that people in a lot of places who are looking at this, from a sort of Marxist perspective, they're coming to similar conclusions.
Right. Thank you, CJ. We're going to get to some of those elements in some detail as we go along, but I'll turn to you, Joe. I have some historians' questions for you, and one is in the aftermath of World War II, fascism in Europe was declared dead. So what happened?
Well, first of all, I want to defend the concept of a new world order. It initially had a very progressive, one of my favorite reggae bands, Steel Pulse, used to sing about a new world order. And then George Bush got a hold to it and used it, and now it has, and then the hip hop community, started making music, responding to it, and and helped turn it into its opposite, which is this growing fascist threat. But in answer specifically to your question, well, it was never defeated after World War II. You had Spain under Franco. You know, you had Portugal under Cateno and Salazar. You know, and then you had a number of iterations of fascism in Latin America with Stroessner in Paraguay, and then there was the coup against Salvador Allende and the rise of Pinochet, and there were the military juntas in Argentina and Brazil, and so on and so forth. So I don't know whoever said that it was over after World War II. I don't know what they were smoking or drinking, or they were taking some of that LSD or peyote that the CIA was using for thought control experiments. But fascism was hardly dead. But more than that, fascism incubates in the beating heart of monopoly capitalism. It grows there, and Lenin, way back when, even before fascism arose, some 20 years, defined imperialism politically as reaction all down the line. And it relies on racism, it relies on sexism, it relies on homophobia and great power chauvinism uh, as uh, chief central ideological ingredients to divide the class. And so until we finally defeat imperialism, fascism is going to be a constant presence until we have a
Thanks.
new socialist world order. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Thanks for reminding me of Steel Pulse, that great band. And also, I looked up New World Order. I thought that was Michael Manley's phrase, but his was New International Economic Order. But it was the same kind of idea, the fact that a new international order was underway. Well, Taryn, to turn to you, what the argument is that the far right manifests itself somewhat differently in different countries, but there are still similarities among all of them. And what strikes you as some of the common characteristics? I know CJ mentioned some, and Joe did too. But what strikes you as some of the common characteristics of these new right or far right movements that are sweeping across Europe, especially?
Well, I think that the role of monopoly that Joe just mentioned is really key here, mainly because monopoly capital can't really get itself out of the bind that it increasingly finds itself in, right? The declining rate of profit. Like, there is no way for capitalism to keep on expanding at the rate that it needs to expand without encountering crisis, the more it becomes subject to like monopoly. And so the answer to this from a fascist's perspective is to step in. This is why it's incubated inside of monopoly capital, is to step in and maintain the power that the bourgeoisie, that the capitalist class, that the imperialist class, that the warmongering class has by any means necessary, basically. And so that means throwing out the rule book when it comes to what's profitable, what's not, what makes sense, what doesn't, and sort of reaching for this last ditch effort of fascism, understanding that that is the only way that these monopoly interests, that these classes can maintain some sort of dominance, at least in the short term, right? Because fascism has always ended, which is really important to remember when we're thinking about things historically and when we're looking at the future in front of us, which might seem a little bit scary. One of the things that I think is interesting, of course, I think that one thing that is deeply held in common between a lot of these fascist tendencies, especially nowadays, is both the sexism, right? The sexism, and it's usually oriented around this idea of birth rate, the idea that children are not being born at the rate that they need to be being born, and it has to be the right type of children, right? It cannot be black and brown children. It's usually white children or the national identities children. There needs to be more of them, and so there's this sort of clamping down on women's rights in order to try and facilitate that. But inside of that, there is like a deep anxiety about the future, which I think is something that monopoly capital also has, right? Is this deep anxiety about the future, understanding that it's not able to deliver on what it needs to deliver for humanity. And I think at the same time, you also see something that's in common is this anti-migrant fervor, right? This idea that there's the other that's coming to take away your things and that we need to destroy them. And whether that happens to, and in the United States especially, and I think increasingly in Europe, it's manifesting in this really disgusting like transphobic behavior, which sort of links between the sexism and the anti-migrant stuff. Because as far as you heard Donald Trump talking about it on television this week, where he's saying, oh, the reason why we don't have nice things is because trans people have their operations paid for by the government or something really ridiculous like this. So they're acting as scapegoats, they want to push things onto the scapegoat, and they want to clamp down on, the possibilities for the future. And that's, I think, something that we cannot lose focus of. And that's why we, I think, need to be sitting around and thinking of really compelling cases for the future that we can talk about with our families and with our coworkers and with the working class more generally, as a way to sort of motivate people towards those solutions as opposed towards the dead end solutions that fascism holds.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, thank you. Thanks, Taryn. CJ, one thing that Taryn mentioned was the anti-LGBTQ, but also I think another element that's common besides just the anti-immigrant is the specifically anti-Islam and anti-Muslim efforts in these countries. I read that 9 European Union states now have legal restrictions on how Muslim women can dress. So telling women how to dress. In France, they were arresting women on the beach for not showing enough skin. So why do you think the far right chooses these kind of culture war battles when really, as you said, economics is the foundation there of these movements?
Yeah, whenever let's say you're one of these, right-wing movements, and you're wanting to achieve power, to put through the various economic and political programs you might have in mind. Well, it's often hard to sell people. And keeping in mind, we're still under bourgeois democracy in most of the countries we're talking about. You still need to win elections at least, or find ways to manipulate them until you get in power. And it's often hard to sell people on abstract economic arguments, or to convince them, you need to take the side of this faction of the capitalist class against that one. So instead, you need other things that are easier for people to understand. And these sort of jingoistic and religious and sexual, all of these kind of divides, they're easier for you to sell to the masses, right? In the case of the anti-Islamic agenda in particular, and this is very strong in Europe, this is also kind of the blowback of the result of 25 plus years of US and European led wars in the Middle East, right? Where you have had prolonged instability in a lot of the Muslim majority countries, which has driven immigration. And immigration, depending on how it is handled, can be destabilizing, right? And so you've seen that in Europe, the powers that be have sort of latched on to using immigrants as a way to explain away the problems and policy failures, right? And it's really melded with this far right narrative that's been around before we got into this crisis of a clash of civilizations, right? Of the West, the enlightened West versus Islam versus the Orient. You can substitute whoever you need to, depending on what votes you need to get. And so we're seeing that play out in Europe, where there has been, it's undeniable, a large influx of immigrants, mostly from countries that have been destabilized by imperialist foreign policy. And so they're using that now as a way, again, it's kind of a distraction tactic in a way, But it melds perfectly well with what part of the capitalist class wants to do in terms of changing what was the previous world order of globalization and open borders, et cetera, that whole narrative.
Mhm. And I just want, since we're talking about Islamophobia, I want to say today is the first day of Ramadan. So Ramadan Mubarak to those who celebrate. Today is the first day of the month for that. Joe, you mentioned, I think you mentioned in your blurb about this week's show, I think it was you, something about the role of shorter avenues of transnational capital in the spread of MAGA around the world. What do we mean? What kind of short avenues of transnational capital have enabled this process of transition around the world?
Shorter avenues of transnational capital. I said that.
That was an exact phrase.
I can't imagine what I was smoking or drinking or popping. I imagine that perhaps what may have been meant by whoever posted that and attributed it to me, because I'm going to claim plausible deniability, because we have a number of different
Oh,
people who are working on the avatar. But I would imagine that what was meant was the speed by which capital moves today
mhm,
um, on the internet via social channels, where you can transfer huge amount of resources just by clicking on a screen. You know, you can change the direction. You can ruin an economy. You can create massive unemployment or massive employment. You can destabilize and so on and so forth. So I imagine that is what was meant, and that makes the political conjecture and the struggle that working people are facing much more difficult, because and particularly when you have groups of capitalists who are combining their resources to, combat the initiatives that labor is taking and that broad masses of people are taking, and so you have to have, in a situation of transnational capital, uh, uh, workers, and this is still a huge problem. We have to be able to combine, to organize internationally to combat it, and to support each other, and so on and so forth. And that becomes much more difficult.
mhm. Thanks, Joe. I think Taryn has come clean as the author of that phrase, but I think it made sense to me as maybe cryptocurrency, a reference to cryptocurrency, for example. Taryn, do you want to clarify, or do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say that internationalism is so key here, right? Like the right wing is able to take advantage of the internet, is able to take advantage of jet planes, of supply chains, things that Marx could have only dreamed about when he was first writing his critique of capitalism. That the extreme right has the ability to move money and also ideas around as much as possible, and as we as communists understand, there are no borders for things like capital, right? Like there are borders, but it moves a lot better. It moves a lot easier than labor does, which is why I think that we have to keep on going back to our fundamental principles of internationalism, right? Because as these sorts of networks get shorter and shorter, as the speed of communication and of movement and of supply chains, where you have a product where a third of the product is made on one part of the world and another third in another part, another third in another part, and then it's sold all the way across the world. We have to start thinking of ourselves as an international working class, and we have to start asserting that reality through what it is that we're doing in our everyday lives, which is another reason why I think there is this kind of increase in xenophobia, right? This increase of saying, hate the migrant, hate the H-1B visa worker for taking your good jobs or whatever, because this is used as a wedge to try and destroy that type of consciousness, which is really, I think, the atom bomb in response to the rise of the extreme right internationally, is us as a working class realizing our internationalism as well, and then starting to assert ourselves internationally as that class. So that's the only thing I would, I guess, add on to it. Joe got it.
It made sense. Okay, back to CJ. CJ, in one of your recent articles, you argued that people think that Trump cozying up to Putin and other far-right forces around the world it seems like it's just chaotic and doesn't make any sense. But you assert that there are patterns that are revealed, and that it does make sense. Something about the Trump segment of the ruling class is really embracing a certain kind of foreign policy on purpose. And you talked about China in this article. Could you tell us about your thesis here? Why?
Yeah,
What are the
sure. I think people, when they look back at historic fascism, and they see this this sort of rising trend internationally, they think, oh, this is a united offensive, an onslaught against democracy and the working class, right? It is that, but people often forget that Hitler and Mussolini almost went to war with each other a few times. Two fascist dictators, and so I make that point to just say that this new order that's emerging is not always as stable as it might look. There are divisions within the capitalist class, both within the U.S. and internationally. And the Trump trade wars, for instance, this big offensive. We're going to have tariffs on Mexico, on Canada, on European Union, and this is meant to give the image of a very confident and assertive and aggressive U.S. capitalism, U.S. imperialism. But behind the scenes, I think what we're witnessing also is the playing out of divisions between two sections of the capitalist class. And the individual figure of Trump can give off this image of chaos and unpredictability, but it's not Trump alone, right? There are bigger forces that are also at work, some aligned with him, some opposing him. And those differences, is what, based on the research I've done, are really grouped around that prolonged economic crisis that I mentioned earlier. The crisis, and Taryn mentioned this also with the falling rate of profit. We had this turn toward finance in the 80s, in the 90s. Globalization was the way forward, free markets, get rid of all kinds of trade barriers. And it seemed to work for a time. Profit rates rose, but it never really stuck. It didn't produce a new model. And so you started to see capital differentiating. Some sectors which were very oriented toward international markets, others which were sort of the losers of globalization. And the Trump movement has spent several years cultivating those so-called losers. And they've done it on the mass movement side too, right? You see MAGA trying to appeal to workers in the so-called Rust Belt who have been the losers from globalization and free trade. And they've appealed to them with truth, right? There is truth. Factories were gone, jobs were lost, wages were down. But they've tried to join that up with this movement of capital, which has other goals in mind, and it's not to build a new world order for workers, American or otherwise. And so when this moves to the level of foreign policy, U.S. capitalism starts to look around. Who are our biggest competitors? And even though conflict with Russia, has taken up a lot of media attention, I think most sectors of U.S. capital see China as the biggest threat, not Russia, not the Russian economy. It's the Chinese economy, which is growing at such a high rate for the last several decades and is forging trade ties around the world. And for a while, those internationally, globally oriented sectors of capital were very skeptical of Trump. They saw his nationalist rhetoric, his talk about tariffs and trade barriers. Oh, that threatens our markets. But you fast forward to a few years later, and now we're at the point where all of the big tech giants of the U.S. have rallied to Trump's side. Before, that wasn't the case. Why is that? They're feeling the heat of competition too on the international stage, mostly from Chinese companies. So I think those are some of the class dynamics and the factors that we have to look at to really understand, because there are people around Trump who have been planning what we're seeing right now. They've been planning it for years. They had it all laid out in 2017 when he came to office, but they weren't able to push it through at the rate they thought they could. But we're witnessing them try to do that now.
Thank you, CJ. Another feature of the far right is this revision of history. I think the classic one is Holocaust denial. Taryn, what do you think about this rewriting of history to serve the interests of the ruling class? One of the worst examples was that Jack Posobiec book that was reviewed in cpusa.org, where he just rewrote the entire world history to suit MAGA. And Posobiec was at the White House just this week visiting Donald Trump. So and also J.D. Vance endorsed his book. So this guy's vision of history, or misvision of history, is really wrapped up in the current trend. So what, Taryn, what do you think about this, and what are some of the worst examples you've seen about misinformation about history that are being perpetrated by MAGA? And then we'll turn to fighting back. I think that's important.
I think that the anti-DEI stuff is just right on the nose with what you're talking about, Anita. There's this idea that history and the academy and schools and mothers and teachers and everybody has become very woke and are pushing this thing called DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which most Americans are pretty fond of those words. That's why they have to, condense it into some sort of acronym. Rewriting history of this country is important to fascists because it makes people, in a very concrete way, it lessens people's class consciousness, right? If you are going to start having children go to school and not learn about the civil rights era, then you are now disarming a whole generation of children from the knowledge that, history in the United States has worked mainly through the African-American struggle and the labor struggle, right? If you are taking out basic historical knowledge, then people don't understand stuff like, hey, we actually used to not have anybody die of measles in this country. We used to, have clean water, and planes used to not fall out of the sky and stuff like that. Very basic things, right? And so then people are ill prepared to deal with what it is that they're presented with, right? Because we as humans collectively look to history for solutions as to how we can move forward. That doesn't mean that history doesn't go away, right? It doesn't mean that all of a sudden, we're not living in a world that was shaped by all of the different labor struggles and struggles for, African-American equality and gender equality and things like that. That stuff still exists. It's just that they are trying to disarm a whole generation by taking that away from them. They're also trying to send a message to say that this stuff is toxic and you shouldn't touch it. And this stuff is controversial and it's bad and it's not accepted by polite company or by how you're going to get ahead in the world, right? That's something that's very important to fascism as well. And I think that the thing that it does most immediately is it discombobulates everybody, right? Like it really throws people off. If you say to somebody, and I noticed this when I was teaching, that I would have students who, would not remember basic events that had happened like 2 years prior that were actually very major events, because they had been sucked into the whole, attention economy of social media and stuff like that, but also because their minds were being shaped by a larger media landscape that had a class agenda behind it, right? In taking away our history of struggle, in taking away our history of how this country was started, of all the different, mistakes that we've made, and also twisting what it is that's left, right? Because you can see that in how a lot of history is digested nowadays too, to try and twist it away from the lessons that we should learn from that, especially when it comes to stuff like what happened in Gaza or what's happening in Palestine, right? That there is this sort of inability to understand that when we say never again, we mean never again, right? For anybody. So yeah, I mean, I think the discombobulation, the disarming, and basically making certain sectors of society disempowered by saying you don't deserve your own history. We're not going to talk about you anymore as if you don't exist. That necessarily sort of knocks people down a few pegs.
Thanks. Yes, that's and that our attention to these different elements really show us how we can fight against this international order. And I think sometimes we have we cave to feelings of helplessness, even in fighting the MAGA forces that we have in this country. How can we possibly affect the international order? But I'm sure that each of you have some ideas about what can we do to fight back against this. Maybe fighting against the anti-immigrant stance, or against the anti-LGBTQ, or against the rewriting of history. Joe, let's start with you. What do you think about what are our first steps in fighting back against this new world order that is not really our new world order?
Building on the last question, there was this saying that I don't know who started it, but until the story of the hunt, um, until the lions and elephants and other big game learn how to write, that the story of the hunt will always be told from the vantage point of the hunter, you know? And and the fact of the matter is that our history, labor history, black history, women's history, LGBTQ history, for a long time was told from the point of view of the heterosexual white ruling class, and it wasn't until that we took to the streets and protest and in struggle and also began to teach ourselves and won those struggles uh, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that our knowledge about our contributions to world history was revealed. And so the battle of ideas, as Rosanna likes to say, is a very important battle, and we have to be knee deep in it. And if they gut it, if they get rid of it, we have to continue to promote it, like we're continuing to study and promote Marxism, Leninism. We have to teach it ourselves, because you can't learn it in the academy in most places, and to the extent that you can, it's in somewhat of a diluted form. But I also think that the basic bread and butter issues that our working class and people are facing are very important, around the price of eggs now. Everybody's, I ain't eggs and I haven't eaten eggs in a long time, but the price of meat has gone up. Gas is still high. The goddamn rent is still too damn high, and so on and so forth. And so we have to struggle around those kinds of issues. But there are also international campaigns, around Cuba and the terrorism, getting them off the terrorism list. Palestine, they want to depopulate that country and remove its people. Are we going to let that happen? And now they're attacking one of the important, progressive governments on the planet, South Africa, and saying that they're going to try to isolate them. And we just had a town hall with the South African party leader, and hands off South Africa, they're saying. And the anti-apartheid movement played a big role in that. But I also think that the communist parties and the workers' parties, in the first place, internationally, have to take hold of this growing fascist threat, and we have to begin combining our forces to fight it. Because it is being coordinated internationally by Bannon and other right-wing groups. It's not accidental that in Italy and Spain and the UK and Germany and in the northern European countries that Brazil, Latin America, Argentina, that they're coordinating and planning, and we have to do that too. The communists were the first to the front of the line in the fight against fascism in the 30s and 40s, and I fear that over the last several years we still have not, as a global movement, recognized the degree of that threat, and therefore decided to organize like we see it as an immediate danger. And as Dimitrov says, if you don't stop it in the preparatory stages, you are kind of complicit with facilitating it.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, the influence of Bannon is really. I was shocked to learn this week when we were reading our background material that the word woke has been adopted into the Italian language as il wokismo. And even in French, which is amazing that they would take a word like woke and allow French people to say it.
Well, I'm woke and proud of it.
Me too. Yeah, I think we are the woke
I'm gonna
party.
get it written into my middle name, Joe Woke Sims.
Yeah, that's good. Why would we be
AW.
asleep? We can't be asleep in these times, definitely. So, well, CJ, and do you have anything to add about how you think, as a journalist, especially how journalists can contribute to the fight back against this international order?
Yeah, I would draw together a lot of the things that Joe and Taryn were both saying. This campaign against DEI, against this campaign to erase history. Yeah, they want to make people forget about the truths of slavery, of Jim Crow, and these kind of things. But they also want to make people forget about the wins that were able to be achieved by the movements who fought back against those things, right? It's not just about making you forget about the injustices, it's making you forget about the successful campaigns to stop them. So I think as journalists, we have a responsibility also to rescue some of that history and remind people and draw the parallels between what those movements did and what we have to do before us today. And the other responsibility we have is to sort of make sense of this blitzkrieg of chaos and attacks that the right wing is trying to engineer, right? That's part of the strategy right now that we've seen since Trump took office, and even before he was back in the White House. This sort of endless barrage of, we're going to tear this down, we're going to attack that, we're going to fire these people, we're going to end this mandate, terminate that program. It's being done in a fashion to sort of make us think like, oh my God, we can't keep up, and it's tempting to just want to throw your hands up and say, well, let's see what happens. I'll try to get involved again later, right? And that's by design. They want us to do that. So I think journalists, progressive and Marxist journalists, they have that responsibility to try to say, hey, don't get discouraged. Let's draw the connections here and show you where we can work together, how we can get organized to push back against some of these things. And then finally, I would just reemphasize that point that Joe was making about the role of communist parties. Internationalism is part of our DNA. Not to brag too much, but more than anyone in the movement's history, the working class movement, we've often been the first to respond to these things, right? And to recognize the dangers, to sound the call, and to make the first steps that eventually result in bigger parts of our working class getting mobilized. And I think we like to talk about being the vanguard, and I think that's a real case of it. Joe mentioned, Dimitrov's words in the 30s, and we're trying to repeat some of that now in new conditions. Just last week, the CPUSA's Labor Commission hosted a forum bringing together communists from Mexico and trade unionists from Mexico, together with those from Canada, Communist Party leaders and trade union activists, to come together and discuss, okay, this is an international threat, this tariff and trade war. It affects workers on all three countries of this continent. So how do we start to discuss together what our responses should be? And we're building. It's not coming out of nowhere. Again, this is building on ties that have been forged, because a lot of the companies that workers in Mexico, U.S., and Canada work for, they're operating in all three countries, and they've been battling some of those companies for years, right? Whether it's GM and Ford, you can name it. So it's also about starting where we have some resources, and I think the communists are trying to play that kind of role, and we need to step it up even more.
Thank you, CJ. I think we'll let CJ have the last word. I think we've done a good review, I think, here of this so-called New World Order that we hope will never come to fruition fully, and how to fight against it. And I think we have to just stay strong, stay in the fight, of course, as we say every week. And thank you all for tuning in to our program this morning. And don't spend any money today, especially not in stores that are national retailers, especially. And we will see you next Friday at 10:30, same time, right here on YouTube. So have a great week. Stay in the fight. Stay strong. Good night. Goodbye, everybody. I must say good night.
Take care.
But that's